So short, but wow, it's going to be really hard to follow that because Rachel is always such a powerhouse. So welcome to the snooze fest of embryology. By a show of hands, how many of you remember learning about ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm? Okay, so everyone, right? How many of you, by a show of hands, actually talk about endoderm in your practice? All right, cool. So this will be fun. I have no disclosures. So we just saw homologous or analogous structures of the external genitalia, the male and the female. So I always like to bring up that the endodermal folds become the male urethra, which are covered by spongiosum and skin, all of that protected and internal, whereas the endodermal folds in the female vulva now are exposed. So this lovely area within that yellow circle between Hart's line of the labia minora all the way up to and including the hymen and the urethral meatus, all of that is exposed to toilet paper, tampons, fingers, lube, soap, body wash, all pads, incontinence pads, irritated, not protected. So when we talk about the endodermal origins, I love that we don't have a laser pointer, but so this yellow highlighted area is the urogenital sinus made of endoderm. And as it progresses, it becomes the bladder, and in a continuum is also the urethra and the vestibule. So why is that important? Because a lot of the symptoms that we ascribe to bladder pathology, nocturia, dysuria, urgency, frequency, that may not actually be just bladder. It could be anywhere along this continuum, including the vestibule. So if you're not looking at and treating pathology of the vestibule, you might be missing an entire range of disease. And we know that when we treat the vestibule, a lot of those nocturia, dysuria, urgency, and frequency symptoms get better. So why is this important? Endodermal urogenital sinus. Well, yes, it creates all of these things listed here, but it also is highly androgen dependent, and we're going to talk about that more, but it's also, so androgen is necessary for development, but also necessary for continued physiology and normal function of these tissues. And it is also subject, and all of these areas are particularly subject to inflammatory disorders and immune disorders. So we've learned in med school, I'm sure many of you remember from residency in med school, that DHT, or dihydrotestosterone, is necessary for the development of the prostate and the bulbar urethral gland and all these male structures. Now, we learned that. No one's ever told me anything about what is necessary for the development of the Bartholin's glands or the vestibular glands. But we do know now that in low androgen states like menopause or using combined oral contraceptive pills, that we have problems that arise in the Bartholin's glands, say they make less lubrication, or in the vestibular glands where they become inflamed and painful on your Q-tip testing. I'm sure you've seen this before, I've presented it several times, but this was a great study done by a dermatopathologist taking biopsy specimens of the vestibule in patients who were not on oral contraceptive pills and those who were. And you can see on the left side of your screen, happy mucosa, many layers of cells, differentiating as they go up and creating glycogen. And for those patients who are on oral contraceptive pills, you see a flat, thin, smaller mucosal protective layer, less glycogen, if any at all, and less differentiation of those cells, which means that when they are exposed to shear forces, intercourse, rubbing, at tight clothes, whatever, you have more possibility for inflammation and irritation. So what else is going on here? When you take the vestibule out, as we do for patients who have neuroproliferative vestibulodynia, but they had normal hormones on testing and no signs of hormonal problems, and you stain them for hormone receptors, this is what we find. So you'll see androgen receptor very richly along the junction between the epithelium and the subepithelial layers, and within that basal layer of the glands. So we've been talking about glands and lubrication and excretion of these substances. So there may be very well a role of androgens in glandular function. And here we are, of course, we know estrogen receptor, absolutely present throughout the mucosa, but not in the glands themselves, all around it on this staining. So we've also seen But when you have premenopausal patients who have irritation in this endodermal vestibule, if you treat them with a combination of estrogen and testosterone, not only do they get better on exam, but their pain scores when you test them with Q-tips also decrease. And this still holds true if you use DHEA or progesterone, which is the building blocks of both androgens and estrogens. So if you administer that, you not only see improvement on their vulvoscopic exam, but their pain scores also go down in time. And really more importantly for patients, their pain with intercourse absolutely improves with continued use. So moving on to inflammation, we have seen lichen sclerosis. This is an inflammatory condition. We still don't exactly understand the pathophysiology of it, but we're getting there. But what is really jumping out at me is that we know this inflammatory condition happens most commonly in a low androgen state. So when something is wrong with the androgen actions, like menopause, oral contraceptive pills, or even spironolactone and Accutane for acne, that's when tissues and patients become subject to this inflammatory condition. There's a link there. In fact, this group that looked at early onset premenopausal lichen sclerosis as a retrospective review looked at 40 patients with lichen sclerosis before menopause and compared them to healthy premenopausal controls. And 100% of those lichen sclerosis patients were on oral contraceptive pills, 100%. And there are some oral contraceptive pills that we know which are specifically anti-androgenic. And if you're on those specific oral contraceptive pills, then your odds ratio for getting lichen sclerosis is 2.5, way higher. So I'm going to try to get through this really quickly. This is a really interesting study looking at now endodermal urogenital sinus in the bladder, again talking about inflammatory conditions. This is a rat model looking at interstitial cystitis. They induced rat interstitial cystitis, and you can see in these three columns there's the sham arm, so not interstitial cystitis rats on the left. In the middle, interstitial cystitis rats that were treated with saline, and then on the right, interstitial cystitis rats treated with mesenchymal stem cells. But what they were really trying to figure out is what happens when you inhibit the mast cells that we think are part of the pathophysiology of interstitial cystitis. Well, in that middle row, you can see those little white arrows, those are mast cells, highly prevalent in the non-treated interstitial cystitis rats, and fewer mast cells showed up if you treat them. And now at the bottom, you'll actually see electron micrograms of the mast cells degranulated most commonly in the untreated interstitial cystitis versus mast cells which had not degranulated in those that were treated. And you can see all the way at the top the H&E normal mucosa on the left, really edematous scar tissue inflamed mucosa of the bladder of these rats in the middle, and on the right side, if you treat them and inhibit their mast cells, their mucosa is pretty similar to normal. And what's really interesting is they did urodynamics on these rats when they were conscious. And at the top, you'll see the normal rat bladder function and contraction. In the middle, spastic bladders of the interstitial cystitis rats. And if you treat them, their bladder symptoms actually get better, or their bladder contractions improve. They also did cell culture with mast cell models, and they found that if they, again, use mesenchymal stem cells, that the release of histamine and 5-HT decreased versus the non-treated mast cells. So interesting there, another endodermal structure, which we know has mast cell dysfunction, the bladder. Now we're looking at mast cell dysfunction in the vestibule, again, along that continuum. So this work that we've been doing really expanded upon what Bornstein figured out in 2008, with more than 8 mast cells per high power field being associated with pain. But we're using computer-assisted histometry to really quantify numerically what is happening. And of course, the next step would be to get control tissues and compare. But we're finding way more than 8 mast cells in this area, and a lot more density of nerves. So, and finally, what's really interesting in the next steps is how do we treat these areas like the 12 o'clock, which you can't just remove and then close the clitoris down to the urethral meatus. So we've been looking at specifically when you remove endoderm, what happens when you replace it with something like buccal mucosa, a technique that many of you have heard about or learned. And that ectodermal tissue, replacing the endoderm, integrates and perhaps is not subject to the same mast cell disorders. So in conclusion, endodermal urogenital sinus, we need androgens there to maintain health and develop in the first place. These tissues are specifically vulnerable to inflammation and immune problems, and it can be anywhere along this bladder urethra vestibule continuum. And so you may need to treat all of these areas, not just one. And so we really need to figure out what is the connection here between androgens, immunology, and normal physiology. Thanks very much.